Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Bob Kincaid, thank you very much, and welcome to this live edition on this Wednesday of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is, as I mentioned, Wednesday. It is the 5th day of December in the year 2018, and it is our first live broadcast this week. And Bob and I were just sharing thoughts on how we were kind of sorry that happened, but you got to do what you got to do. But anyway, we are here today, and we look forward to spending a couple of hours with you. We're having our first measurable snowfall here. We hit a couple of inches overnight, and the roads were pretty bad this morning. They're a little bit better now, and we're looking for a potentially major snowstorm coming up in the south this Sunday. So Sunday into Monday. So got to keep our eye on that one. That one looks like it could be fairly substantial in the range of a foot of snow, something like that. So it's been a couple of years since we've had anything that substantial at one time. So I think we've become a little bit spoiled maybe by our warm winters. This one is starting out like it's not going to be like the last few have been. So a couple of friends of mine even talked about buying snowblowers in the hope that they can cast a spell on the weatherman so that the bad weather won't come. It's just like carrying an umbrella with the threat of rain. Frequently when you carry an umbrella because it looks like rain, it never does. So I don't know what the umbrella has to do with it, but some people believe it has everything to do with it. So anyway, welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's been some time since we've been together. It's been a full week. And of course, for those of you who've been watching television this morning on this national holiday, President Trump declared today a national holiday, a national day of mourning because of the funeral of George Herbert Walker Bush, and I've been watching that this morning, like everybody else, watching the cameras pan around and see who's there and who's talking to whom and all of that. And sometimes I think more than anything else that's what this is about. I do want to go spend a little bit of time at the beginning of our program today on George Bush Sr., President Bush Sr., number 41 as opposed to number 43. But before I do that, I want to basically get the daily housekeeping out of the way, which is to give you our phone numbers and encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity to come on the air and share your thoughts, your observations, your ideas, suggestions, questions, whatever they might be. The point is that our listeners would appreciate hearing from you. For one thing, it would be a break from listening to me. But more important, all of us, myself included, learn from this kind of interaction. In fact, at the end of the program today in our second hour, I'm planning, if things work out properly, to get into a piece that I've written recently, and it kind of deals, at least a little bit, with this idea of communication and the ability to communicate and solve problems together, learn from each other, as it were. But first, let me share our phone numbers with you. We have two numbers, either one of which will get you directly into the Head On Radio Network studios. Bob's there today, as I'm sure you heard at the beginning of our program. And if you call, Bob will get you on the air immediately. And all I want you to know is that you will be welcome. I will be extremely grateful to you for doing that. The first number is area code 304-574-8178. 304-574-8178. The second number, same area code, 304-640-2829. 640-2829. So the two numbers, both of them the same area code, 304-574-8178, 640-2829. If you'd like to communicate directly with me and share your thoughts or concerns that way, then you can do that. You can either send me an email or you can contact me through our Facebook page. If you are inclined to send me an email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. Or the other way, the other alternative, is our Facebook page. If you go to the homepage of Facebook, facebook.com, you'll see a search box at the top of the page. And if you type in the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution, you'll be onto our Facebook page and you'll see a number of postings there. In fact, at the beginning of the program today, I'm going to address one of those postings, which I just put on there yesterday, I believe, late yesterday, as I recall. But with every posting, there are two links at the end of each posting. One that is a share link, and the other one is a comment link. If you click on the share link, it sends that particular posting to everybody on your who's a friend on your Facebook page. In other words, your Facebook friends get a copy of that posting if you click on share. If you click on comment, it gives you an opportunity to comment or communicate directly with me. The presumption, of course, of Facebook would be that the comment would be related to the particular posting, but that doesn't necessarily have to be true, because I'll get notice from Facebook that somebody has commented on a particular posting. And when I go there, I'll get your comment immediately, and I'll basically read it. It may be related to that posting, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. The point is, we would love to hear from you. We would love to get your input and your reaction to some of the issues and items that we talk about here on the Virtual Center. There's a lot of commentary. I spend probably more time than I should on news of the day, but it's hard not to dwell on it. And of course, over the last couple of days through the weekend, the focus has been on the death of George Herbert Walker Bush and the upcoming funeral, which is probably over by now. I watched it until about 20 minutes to the hour, and it looked like it was winding down. I'll be very honest with you. One of the reasons that I wanted to watch was because of a couple of the eulogies that were going to be presented. In reading on the internet about the service, the memorial service that was going to be held at the National Cathedral today, I saw that two of the eulogies would be delivered by John Meacham, the historian. Really do enjoy George H. Simpson of Wyoming. He was a Republican. He is a Republican. I always enjoyed him, mainly because I enjoyed his sense of humor. And he and George Herbert Walker Bush were fast friends. And I knew that him delivering the eulogy would be rich, and it was. And of course, what they were doing was celebrating President Bush's sense of humor, which was infectious. It's something that I think one of the things that we will miss. I want to get into a little bit about President Bush today. Not a lot, because I think there's been so much over the last couple of days. But there's one particular issue that was raised about him in a piece that I read just this morning, and I really wanted to share with you because I thought it was really insightful and really helpful and raised some very, very interesting questions. And I wanted to get into that with you. But first of all, I just wanted to make a comment or two. Many of you may know that last evening, the special counsel's office put out a heavily redacted assessment for Michael Flynn. And one of the things that the special counsel's office did was recommend no jail time for Michael Flynn because of the substantial contributions he's made to the investigation since the very beginning. If you remember, he was one of the first ones to come around, plead guilty, and agree to work with the special counsel. So he's been there for a long time. And according to the special counsel, in this sentencing document, which was heavily redacted, there was so much taken out of it, it looked like at first that there was nothing in it that we could use. But the fact of the matter is there was quite a bit in it. And it stands to reason that the mere fact that there's so much redacted is an indication that there's a lot going on and there's a lot of information being exchanged. And the media, of course, is convinced that the special counsel is wrapping up the case or is beginning to circle the wagons, and in the near future will come out with something big. Friday is a sentencing document for Paul Manafort, and as we know, Paul Manafort has been found guilty, pleaded guilty to a number of things, including lying to the special counsel. So it's unlikely that the special counsel's office is going to recommend no jail time for him. But that's one of the things that I think has occurred since the last time we were together here at the Virtual Center. And of course, the other thing is the appearance Monday of the director of the CIA, Gina Haspel, in a closed-door meeting with members of the Senate on the alleged murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul, Turkey. And the reactions that have come out of that meeting are pretty powerful. Because a number of senators, many of them Republicans, Lindsey Graham being one, Bob Corker being another, have been very, very strong in their criticism of the White House, of the Trump administration, for looking to turn the interest in public opinion in a different direction and basically deny that the evidence against Prince Mohammed Al Salman as being definitive. These people came out of that meeting with the CIA director convinced that the evidence is so overwhelming. Bob Corker made the point that if that case went to trial, there would be a guilty verdict within 30 minutes. That was how overwhelming he felt the evidence was. So there's quite a bit of pressure on the White House to come up with a different strategy than try to claim that the evidence against the Crown Prince is not definitive. They're feeling that it surely is. It's unclear as to what's going to happen because everything today is on hold, obviously, because of the memorial service for a fallen president, for a deceased president. And it was really something to see the front row with all the presidents and their wives in the first row, and the fact that President Trump interacted not at all with the other presidents who were there. And all three of them sitting in his row were had been Democratic presidents, Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama, and Bill Clinton. And the only interaction that President Trump had with another president was George W. Bush when the family came in for the service. And George Bush made it a point to go over and shake hands with each of the four former presidents. And other than that handshake, that short interaction, I didn't see in all the time I watched it any interaction at all between President Trump and the other presidents that were there. But there's absolutely no question that when today is over, when this declared holiday is over, and Washington gets back to, I was going to say business as usual, whatever that might be, this issue of a mini uprising within Republican members of the Senate over the Khashoggi situation could be significant. Although a number of commentators have made the point, and I think it's well placed, that it's one thing to express verbally opposition or concern about differences between what you see and what the president admits to seeing. But on the other hand, there's something quite different from that about doing something about it. And we haven't seen any of that as yet. Now, whether we will or not, it's unclear. But I think that's significant as well. And then, of course, the fallout from the G20 meeting in Argentina last week, and the apparent 90-day truce, if you will, on the tariff war between the United States and China. I thought it was very significant that the stock market tanked yesterday, principally in reaction to some of the confusing statements that President Trump has made. President Trump basically came out of that G20 meeting talking about the fact that this has been a great step forward and that the agreement had been reached in everything with China, and the markets responded positively. But the more the president talked, the more it became clear that what the president was saying happened and what really happened are quite a bit different. And once the markets began to react to that confusion, to that contradiction, as you were, they tanked. I think the Dow Jones yesterday was down something like almost 800 points, 790 some odd points. That kind of fluctuation in the stock market is not good. And it's too dramatic. 800, of course, is a major move. I mean, that's significant. But it's almost become routine that the market goes up or down over 100 points each day. 150, 175 points one way or the other is not out of the ordinary anymore. And that's too volatile for the market in terms of the stability of the market, because people have been encouraged to invest in a stable future. And the fact of the matter is, increasingly, corporate America principally is focusing on short-term gain rather than the long term. So consequently, there seems to be a disconnect in the way people look at the market. The small investor The individual person who's looking for safety and security, stability for their retirement is looking long term. They want to make sure that when they put their money, whatever it might be, their life savings in the market and invest, they want to be sure that they're investing in something secure and stable. And in order to do that, they're encouraged to look long term, because over long periods of time, the market produces positive results. But the problem is short term. And increasingly, too many of the largest investors, hedge fund managers and others, are looking toward the short term, not the long term. And I think that's creating a disconnect, a discord, or a contradiction, if you will, that is producing volatility in the market. And the last thing the market likes to see is a lot of volatility. So it's very unclear. The other things that many people are beginning to see is the looming possibility, if not probability, of another recession. And there's been an awful lot of talk and an awful lot of writing about some of the signs coming out of Wall Street that indicate that a recession may be in the nation's future, not necessarily immediately, but within the foreseeable future. So even though the market, the economy continues to look relatively strong, there are signs, for example, the yield rates in the bond markets and things like that, which are indicating concern amongst a number of people. So I think that also is a factor that we also have to keep in mind and take notice of. The thing that I really see, as besides the Mueller investigation itself, that seems to bear the most attention, the most watching, is the Khashoggi situation, because there's mounting pressure on the nation, on government, to do something positive in response to the Khashoggi murder, to hold Saudi Arabia responsible, and to make it very clear that this violates everything that this nation stands for, and we cannot continue to let our self-interest drive a foreign policy that seems to be violating every principle, every value that this nation subscribes to. And I think, and part of that is the war in Yemen. And the reports that as many as 85,000 children may have died from disease and starvation during this war. And the fact that there's so much hunger and starvation in that nation now, that if something isn't done to bring this war to an end, the deaths can do nothing but continue to rise. And there's increasing talk that we need to begin to hold Saudi Arabia responsible for a lot of this destruction and a lot of this human suffering. And that maybe with the Khashoggi thing revealing what it reveals, many people are beginning to say maybe it's time that we bail out of the support for Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, as many people point out, the world cannot afford another failed nation in the Middle East. The last thing we can afford to want to see happen is for the Saudi regime to become shaky over this. The issue is, how do you hold them responsible and at the same time make sure that they remain stable and influential in the region. So I think it's a political problem, but I think it's an important one, and I think it's one that all of us will need to kind of keep an eye on. I mentioned that, excuse me, that I put a message on Facebook yesterday, and I wanted to make reference to it in today's program because I think it's very significant. It's been unfolding over the last couple of days. And in fact, from what I read in this morning's major papers, I saw this in the Times and I think the Washington Post as well, that there was a vote yesterday in the state of Wisconsin where Republicans, who, even though they lost the governorship and the attorney general's race to Democrats in the November elections, Republicans were still able to retain control of both houses of the legislature, and that they were moving legislation through in the dark of nights. They apparently put in an all-night session in order to draft a number of bills, pieces of legislation that are designed to weaken the power of the incoming Democratic governor, who's not due to take power until after the first of the year. This is what the infamous lame duck session that's going on right now, because the results of the November election don't change people until January. And so what we mean is that what that means is for the next several weeks, the party that lost the election for governor is still in control of the state legislature and will keep control. And so, in effect, what's happening in Wisconsin and other states as well, Michigan, North Carolina, is that even though Republicans lost significant numbers of seats in Congress in the midterm elections, in a number of states, Republicans are refusing to concede defeat, refusing to concede the election and acknowledge defeat, and are in effect pushing through legislation which flies in the face of the election returns. And when I saw this unfolding in the first of the week, day before yesterday, I really felt it important to address this issue because I think it's really important. I think it speaks to what's going on in Washington. I think that it says something very significant about the personality of our president and the nature of the political administration that he's put in place in Washington during the first 2 years of his administration. I think it speaks to a level of arrogance and boldness that never would have surfaced if not for the Trump presidency. And so basically, I felt moved to put something on Facebook. And part of the reason is personal, to be very honest with you. I think many of you know that I spent several years in Wisconsin. I went to graduate school there, received my degrees from the university there in Madison. And I have a very warm feeling for that state and for the people of that state. And so, like many other people, I've watched over the last several years during the governorship of Scott Walker in Wisconsin and cringed. Specifically, what bothered me was what Scott Walker was doing to the university. That through these frequent cutbacks in expenses, in budgets, and reductions in state agency budgets, there were some reports coming out of the university that certain segments of the university were in trouble because of the extreme nature of some of these cuts. And it bothered me, obviously, because of the feeling I have for the university. I felt, and long felt, that university is one of the premier universities in the country. It's strong. It's strong in a number of areas. It's been strong for many decades. And I felt that in the name of budget, to take a chance on reducing the quality and the effectiveness of an institution like that is literally shooting yourself in the foot. So I felt very careful about, very concerned about that. What I said on Facebook, of course, refers to the political shenanigans of Republicans in that state, in the state of Michigan, North Carolina being the three major ones, I believe. And what I said was that I never thought I'd live long enough to see some of the things that are going on now in our nation happening. But here they are. Republicans have become so bold, so arrogant, that they don't even try to hide their willingness to flaunt the will of the people when it suits them. The results of the election said one thing. Wisconsin legislature is saying something quite different. And then I mentioned my own personal interest in this. I spent several years in Wisconsin, attended the graduate school, et cetera, and one of the things that appealed to me, long appealed to me as a historian, is Wisconsin's history. Because that state was in the leadership, was in the forefront of the progressive movement at the beginning of the 20th century. One of the most progressive governors in the nation's history was Governor Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. And the more I became familiar with the La Follette administration and what the government under La Follette was doing in the state of Wisconsin, the stronger became my feeling for that state and for the history of that state. For example, one outgrowth that I know about, because it relates to the university, is the birth of what history calls the Wisconsin idea. The University of Wisconsin was in the forefront of this idea, and it was really a product of Robert La Follette's administration. La Follette was committed to making the university one of the most prestigious and service-oriented universities in the country. His argument was that the people of Wisconsin were gifted to have a university of that caliber. And of course, as taxpayers, they were paying for it. And they had a right to expect positive results from their investment in their university. And so basically, what the administration began to do was push the idea of public service from the university. The university would develop the experts in various fields, who would then apply their expertise to the state in service to the people. And the state of Wisconsin would lead the nation in providing services to citizens. And this became eventually the mission associated with the idea of land-grant universities. And other states throughout the middle of the country began to adopt the same formula. Michigan State University of Michigan, for example, University of Iowa, Indiana, Ohio State, etc., etc. Wisconsin was in the forefront. And they were the one that historians have given the name the Wisconsin idea, because this was a totally new role for higher education. And unfortunately, I'm not sure whether higher education around the country is still able to live up to that ambitious mission. Every day for several years, one of the first things that I do when I go on the computer in the morning is to look at a daily email from a fellow graduate student of mine from Wisconsin named Bob Bliss. Bob and I met in graduate school in 1965. So that means we've basically been friends for close to 50 years. We've become close friends. Several years ago, before he came back to the States, Bob taught in Great Britain, in England, in Lancashire. I believe he taught at Lancashire University for 27 years, if I'm not mistaken. So when I left Wisconsin, I came to West Virginia. Bob went to Great Britain. And he taught there until he came back to the United States several years ago, 10, 12 years ago, something like that, to accept a dean's position at the University of Missouri at St. Louis. And he's still there. He's not dean anymore. He retired from that, but he still teaches at the university. Bob developed a habit in Great Britain of acknowledging his students' birthdays. He made it a point to keep a record of the birthday of every student in his class. And what he would do would be to write a particular historical vignette to celebrate that particular birthday. He doesn't call them birthday notes, he calls them anniversary notes. And when he came back to the States and went to Missouri St. Louis, he continued his tradition of daily anniversary notes. And he still does it every single day, weekends included. The first thing I get in the morning is Bob's anniversary note for that day. They are brilliant. And over the years, his readership on the internet has expanded more and more to the point that now he's well over 1,000 subscribers who receive his anniversary notes every single day, as I do. Bob Kincaid gets them as well. Bob asked me to get him on the list a number of years ago. Bob Bliss was here on a history grant that I had, and he and Bob Kincaid met. He learned about the anniversary notes, and Bob wanted him. We frequently chat about a particular anniversary note that Bob's put together. They're brilliant. He writes them every single day. In fact, I've spent some time staying with the Blisses, and I can attest to the fact that he writes these early in the morning. The first thing he does when he gets up, if you look at the internet, at his email, and look at the time it was posted, it's almost always before 7 a.m. So every single morning he gets up, the first thing he does is write something new, and he writes with a masterful pen. They are brilliant. Well, my point is that while this Wisconsin issue was eating at me, it just so happened that very morning, which was yesterday, Bob's anniversary note for December 4th was to highlight the birthday of Cotton Mather, Puritan minister in early New England, in 17th century New England. And I know quite a bit about Cotton Mather, so I was very interested in that particular anniversary note. And Bob opened his short account in celebration of Cotton Mather's birthday yesterday by quoting from Mather. And this is the quote: "Democracy, I do not conceive that ever God did ordain as a fit government either for church or commonwealth. If the people be governors, who shall be governed?" Unquote. And that is a quote from Cotton Mather that Bob used to lead into yesterday's piece. I thought it was so appropriate, given what was happening in Wisconsin, to the whole concept of democracy. And more than anything else, that coincidence, if you will, is what prompted me to sit down yesterday and put together this particular Facebook posting. David Lenhart, who's a regular columnist for the New York Times, wrote a piece in yesterday's Times about the situation in Wisconsin and Michigan and about the behavior of these Republicans who are trying to hold on to power by minimizing the power of those elected to replace them. And this is a quotation from Lenhart's piece yesterday. "No one is really bothering to hide the purpose of this lame duck legislation, to continue the Republicans' hold on state government, even at the expense of core democratic principles like respect for the separation of powers and majority rule." And then he criticizes the kind of legislation and what these people are doing, even though the voters of Wisconsin basically voted to go in a different direction. And basically, my conclusion in that posting was, I'm really concerned about the future of our republic. Because in 1787, the framers put together a system of separation of powers and checks and balances that was based on the idea of deliberation, negotiation, give and take, compromise. And look what's happening in states like Michigan and Wisconsin and North Carolina. And then I recalled right after the November elections early last month, Mitch McConnell on the floor of the Senate spoke about the incoming Democrats and the rumors that were flying around that the Democrats were going to come in with a chip on their shoulder and they were going to seek revenge. And they were going to begin to hold hearings. And they were going to challenge Republicans in every way they could. McConnell made the case that he and his Republican colleagues were working and looking forward to working in a bipartisan nature with the incoming Democratic majority in Congress. And that he hoped that the Democrats wouldn't come into power looking for revenge or looking to get even, but rather were willing to look forward and work together with Republicans to do it. I couldn't believe it. Given Mitch McConnell's record as the leader of the Senate through the Obama years and the first 2 years of Donald Trump's administration. If you recall, McConnell made the point when Obama was elected that his number one political goal was to make sure that President Obama was a one-term president. And then when Barack Obama was reelected in 2012, McConnell's reaction, his promise, was that he would use Senate control in the hands of Republicans to block every single piece of Obama legislation that came before that body. In effect, he promised obstruction, and he delivered. And now that the Democrats have won control of the House, he's basically warning the Democrats that Republicans are looking to work with them rather than fight with them. All I can think of is the founders would react extremely negatively to some of the things that are going on in today's political world. It's making it look like it's going to take a long time before our political system recovers, if indeed it does fully recover from what's happening to it now. The distrust. Indeed, it's almost hatred. You could see it this morning in the first row of the National Cathedral during President Bush's memorial service. Previous presidents there, no conversation, no goodwill, evident at all between the current president and these previous presidents and their spouses. It does not look good for the future of the country. And many of you may know, by the way, that the Bush family, when it was clear that President Bush Sr.'s health was failing and failing rapidly, made contact with the president, with the Trump administration, some months ago. Made it a point that they wanted him and the First Lady to attend a memorial service for Senior President Bush, indeed, when the day came. And they promised him that there would be nothing personal, no personal attacks or anything like that. That the memorial service will be all about memorializing the life of the late president. And I guess they followed through, and that's the reason that President Trump came. And of course, you'll remember that President Trump was not invited to the funeral service for John McCain. That was John McCain's wish. So it just doesn't look well for what's happening in the country, and I really worry about it. We've got about 10 minutes left in our first hour today, and I wanted to deal with an issue that I think we probably can cover in those 10 minutes, but I really believe it's important. This is an article that appeared some days ago. I think it was the 2nd of December, which would have been late last week, I believe. 2nd, I believe, was Sunday, if I'm not mistaken. It's an article by David Lenhart, whose name I mentioned just a while ago, about capitalism. And the title of Lenhart's article is that American capitalism is not working. And I thought it had some pretty interesting insights. And I didn't want to let today's program pass without sharing a couple of them with you. Lenhart points out that in 1944, in October of 1944, a corporate executive named William B. Benton, B-E-N-T-O-N, who was co-founder of Benton and Bowles, the large ad agency, wrote an article in Fortune magazine. The title of his article was The Economics of a Free Society. If you go online, I did, and you look up Benton's Economics of a Free Society, you'll get the link to the 1944 article. And in that piece, written in 1944, Benton wrote the following. Basically, what he was talking about is the economy when the war was over, when World War II had ended. And what Lenhart points out in the article is that there was a lot of fear in the country that when the war ended, the nation would slide right back into the depression that it had been through in the 1930s. Because many Americans realized that it was only the war that temporarily ended the depression, because it created all these jobs, all these manufacturing and military jobs. But when the war ended and the troops came home, the jobs would disappear, and the thinking was that the nation would just slide right back into the depression that Roosevelt, who was still alive in 1944, seemed unable to solve. Basically, what the economics of a free society is about is Benton's formula for what has to happen in order to turn the end of the war in the positive direction. He writes, "Today, victory is our purpose." Obviously talking about military victory. "Tomorrow, our goal will be jobs, peacetime production, high living standards, and opportunity." Those goals, he said, depended on American business accepting what he called the necessary and appropriate government regulation, and accepting as well the existence of labor unions. It depended on companies not earning profit at the expense of the welfare of the community. It depended on rising wages. What Benton's article was asking for was a continuation of the active involvement of government in the nation's economy. Benton was aware that unrestrained capitalism was dangerous to everyone in the nation. And he realized that government had to play a role in it if the nation was going to continue to prosper, and if we could avoid the slide back into the negatives of depression. So what he was basically asking business to do was fully accept government regulation as necessary and as appropriate. Lenhart points out that during the 50s and 60s, Corporate America followed that formula. Executive salaries were kept moderate, were kept rather low. Corporate executives continued to care about their workers and about the communities they lived in. Middle-class incomes continued to go up through the 50s and 60s at a faster rate than CEO income. Consequently, income equality in the country began to decline. Inequality in the country began to decline. Middle-class working people's salaries were going up. Corporate salaries were under control. But Lenhart points out all of that began to change in the 70s. Greater global competition, higher prices for energy, and memories of the Great Depression fading into the past saw executives become more aggressive. Increasingly, they began to decide that their principal mission was to grow the cost, grow the value of the stock in the companies they managed. In other words, guaranteeing profit for shareholders emerged as the number one corporate priority, not concern for employees, not recognition of the rights of workers, not commitment to the communities or to the employees themselves. Instead, corporate executives, began to fight for deregulation, government deregulation, lower taxes, a union-free workplace, lower wages, and, of course, higher pay and benefits for themselves. They justified it by promising that the nation would experience new economic growth, a boom. It never happened. The boom that the nation saw in the 50s and 60s was never repeated in the 70s or thereafter, even though it was promised. And America still falls for that same promise. President Trump's tax bill that he signed into law last December, promising that the tax cut was going to put so much money back into the economy that the degree of growth the economy would experience would more than make up for the loss of government income from the tax cuts. The fact of the matter is, since 1979, median earnings for working people have grown at a rate of 0.1% a year. And most families in America today aren't worth what they were worth 20 years ago. Living standards have stagnated. Most families are not enjoying the rapidly rising level of standard of living that the nation experienced in the 50s and 60s. Lenhart points out that the solution ultimately is going to have to be more taxes on the wealthy. But the fact of the matter is, what the nation needs to do, he says, is rethink what we want American corporations to be. What kind of corporate America does the nation need, in other words? And then he goes to a proposal being put together by Elizabeth Warren, whom many expect is going to make a run for the Democratic nomination in the election of 2020. She basically is putting together a plan where companies would once again invest in workers and in their communities. Yet she realizes that it's not going to happen by itself, that somehow you got to force it to happen. You got to pass legislation to make it happen. So she's proposed a bill in the Senate, and a House Democrat is proposing the same thing in the House, that would require corporate boards to consider the interests of consumers, customers, employees, and communities in corporate decision making. And in order to make sure that happens, what the bill would do would basically allocate 40% of a corporation's seats on its board would be elected by employees. Employees in that corporation would elect 40% of the members of the board that makes the corporate decisions for the corporation. It's similar to what Germany is doing in shared governance in its corporate decision making. I think we call it co-determination, where working people or representatives accountable to the working people sit on the corporate boards of every corporation by law. That's the legislation that Elizabeth Warren is putting forth. And it looks like she's going to run her coming campaign on that particular issue. What Lenhart says is that this whole issue needs to be discussed, needs to be debated. What exactly do we want? This is his point, and I think it's a good one. If Benton and other corporate executives that went along with his article from 1944 and looked at the call for regulation that he makes then, today we would call it socialism. It is being called socialism. The fact of the matter is we got to get beyond the labels, and we need to begin to talk seriously about the kind of nation we want, the kind of business climate we want, the relationship between government and business that we want. I thought that this particular piece had a lot to say. I was especially taken by Elizabeth Warren's inclination to adopt the same policies as exist in Germany, which really put working people on corporate boards of governance. I think it's very significant. We've gone a little bit beyond the top of the hour, and I do apologize for that. It's 4 minutes after. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break right now, and then we'll come back and we'll do our complete our second hour here on this Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center. So we're going to take a short break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Well, thank you, Agnes, and welcome. It's great to hear your voice. Welcome to our second hour here on today's Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Wednesday, the 5th day of December, and if you are just joining us, we welcome you to today's program. If you've been with us through the first hour, as we kind of looked at the this, that, and the other associated with the news over the last several days, then I really want to thank you for staying with us. Let me open this hour, as I did the first, by giving you our phone numbers and inviting you to participate more actively in our program by coming on the air with us. You can do that by calling directly into the Head On Radio Network studios. Agnes is there, and she'll get you on the air immediately. There are two phone numbers, either one of which will work fine. Both of them have the same area code, 304. One of them, 304-574-8178. The other, 304-640-2829. If you'd like to communicate with me, but you don't want to come on the air to do it, then you can send me a communication either through email or on our Facebook page. If you'd like to send me an email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. If you'd like to communicate with me directly on our Facebook page, just go to the homepage, facebook.com, and in the search box at the top, type in the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution. You'll be onto our Facebook page, and you'll see a number of the postings there. And the postings that I just went through at the end of our first hour on what's going on in Michigan and Wisconsin among Republican members of the legislature there, that's the last posting you will see, the first posting you will see, because it's the last one, the most recent one I've done. With each posting, there's a share box and a comment box or link. If you click on the share link, that particular posting will be shared with all of your friends on your Facebook account. If you click on the comment section, the comment button, then you'll get the opportunity to send a direct comment to me, ostensibly about that posting, but in fact it can be about anything that's on your mind related to our programs. Know that I would love to hear from you, and I also reserve the right to get your ideas on the air if it seems something that our other listeners would benefit from. And that way maybe I can use your ideas or your comments to initiate the kind of interactive discussion that technology makes possible for us here at the Virtual Center. The point is, however you do it, I want you to know that your thoughts would be welcome, your involvement in the program is appreciated, and your continued support for it and for the Head On Radio Network is appreciated as well. So with that then, and I apologize for the phone ringing in the background, but I've been deluged with sales calls today, and I just have gotten into the habit of not answering them. So if it's an important call, they'll leave a voicemail and I'll get back to them. I mentioned that there were a couple of things that I wanted to deal with in our second hour. And one of them relates to the memorial service for George Herbert Walker Bush, not George W. Bush. I got to make sure I don't make that mistake. His father, Bush 41. It's an article that appeared in today's. It didn't appear previously. It is currently in today's edition of the New York Times by a regular columnist, Ross Douthat. Douthat is a conservative columnist that hasn't been with the Times all that long. Perhaps a year, maybe a little bit more than that, but it doesn't seem like it's much more than that. He writes a column, and of course, there are any number of columns on the Bush, on President Bush's passing, and on the memorial service today, and on whether President Trump and Melania are going to be at the service and all these other things. I looked through a number of these articles. And I, like many of you, certain of these articles are really memorable. For those of you who are regular readers of Maureen Dowd's column in the New York Times on Sunday, her column on her years-long relationship with George Herbert Walker Bush is incredible. It is just filled with interesting insights and information about the love-hate relationship, if you will, that existed between Bush while he was president and continued well on after that. One of the things she points out is that because she was so hard on Bush's son, George W. Bush, principally for the Iraq War, and for the degree to which she believed that George W. Bush was allowing himself to be manipulated by the neocons within his own White House, Vice President Cheney specifically, Donald Rumsfeld, not quite so much, but as involved. But it never, it strained, but it never severed her ongoing relationship with George W.'s father. And she credits that to him. He never asked her to go easy on George W. And while he took issue with some of the things she said about him, he never let it become so personal that it interfered with the relationship materially. In fact, she shares some notes and letters that George Bush Sr. wrote to her, in which he owned up to the fact that he can't really explain this strange relationship they have. He said, I get mad at you, I get angry at you, I swear I'm not going to read anything you write again, I swear I'm going to cancel my subscription to the Times, but I never do. And then she basically closed with a letter that he wrote her, I think in 2006, if I'm not mistaken, in which he spoke to the hostility and the disagreements between them. And basically said that in spite of it all, if you ever need a shoulder to cry on or you ever need a friend, I'm here and I'll not let you down. And she basically spoke to the fact that that was the George Herbert Walker Bush that she knew. And I've heard that particular portion of the letter quoted on a number of media outlets since Sunday, since it first appeared. That was to me, one of the most telling, one of the most moving accounts, articles on the life of George Herbert Walker Bush. Another was the note that President Bill Clinton left in the Oval Office for incoming President George Herbert Walker Bush. And Bush speaks to the tradition where outgoing presidents usually leave a note in the president's desk in the Oval Office for the incoming president. And Bill Clinton has kept that note and has treasured it. because it's so warm and so honest and so human. That and the More in Doubt article were two of the articles that I believed probably moved me the most. But I think, like everybody else, I've kind of gotten into the psychological frame of mind this weekend to begin to look at the positives of the Bush administration and downplaying or pushing into the background the negatives. I think it goes with the territory. It's understandable because I think we all feel somewhat that way. I remember the Willie Horton ads in the 1988 campaign, the campaign against Dukakis. I thought they were vicious, and I couldn't believe that President Bush had stooped that low to win an election that way. And there were a number of other things that happened and President Bush was responsible for that disturbed me as well. But on the other hand, I've also come to the conclusion that I really can't criticize him for the fact that he's human, because he's the first one to admit that. He said it frequently, that he's not perfect, but he believes that he tries. To the article by Ralph Dothart in today's New York Times, I think it's got something to say. A number of you won't like it. I didn't like it. Because basically what Dothart is doing is justifying elitism, justifying an aristocracy. But the fact of the matter is, what he's speaking to is the fact that we've always had one. And maybe the fact of the matter is there are certain keys or certain aspects of an elite that we miss. Basically, what Dothart points out to is the fact that so much nostalgia about President Bush and about his presidency are coming to the fore this weekend because of the death, and it's very understandable that would happen. And what he's doing is recounting some of the reasons for it. The fact that President Bush was a military hero. He was one of the last of the World War II generation that's rapidly dying out. That there's a tendency to look much more favorably on him than his son George W. because of the Iraq War. In other words, President Bush Sr. looks good in the area of foreign policy because his son didn't. And then, of course, and this I think is an important one, all of us spend time constantly comparing our current president with previous ones. And the fact of the matter is, whenever you do that, no matter which previous president you're talking about, they look good. They tend to look good. In fact, I think one of the things that I saw a column last week that was in the Washington Times, the conservative newspaper in Washington, D.C., about George Bush. And basically, the point of the article was that people are comparing President Bush with President Trump. And that's causing a lot of people to look more and more fondly at President Bush because President Trump doesn't stack up well. In other words, this particular piece was arguing that the reason that Bush looks so good this weekend is in part because of our tendency to compare him with President Trump. But then Delthart goes into the theme of his article. And he said there's more to it than that. There's more to it than the dying out of the World War II generation, than the contrast between Bush and his son as presidents, the contrast between Bush and the current president, President Donald Trump. But there's more. And he goes to two articles in the Atlantic magazine that speak to something else about the Bush nostalgia that's so obvious and so visible this weekend. One of the articles is by Peter Beinart. And Beinart makes the case that part of the nostalgia for President Bush the Elder was that he, to many people, was the last president that they believed to be legitimate to both Democrats and Republicans. You know, if you think about it, there's something to that. If you think back to all the presidents since George W. Bush Sr., none of them have been appealing to Democrats and Republicans alike. Bush's one single term from 1988 to 1989 to 1993, when Bill Clinton took over, the elder Bush is the last president that people from all sides believed to be legitimate. He was a real president. He's what the presidency is about. Other presidents, people find something wrong with them. That's Beinart's theme. But also in the Atlantic, another column by Franklin Foer, F-O-E-L, addresses what he calls the subtext of Bush nostalgia. And let me read you the quote from his article. A fondness for a bygone institution known as the establishment. Hardened in the cold of New England's boarding schools, acculturated by the late-night rituals of Skull and Bones at Yale, sent off to the world with a sense of noblesse oblige. For more than a century, the establishment resided at the top of the American caste system. Now it's gone, and apparently people wish it weren't. Unquote. What Foer is talking about is that part of the fondness, part of the nostalgia for President Bush speaks to the fact that President Bush represented something that no longer exists in America, which is the idea of an elite. He was born and raised to be president, to be one of the nation's leaders. He was educated in the best schools, in private boarding schools, at Yale University. And he served the nation in a number of capacities. In many ways, he was the most prepared president we've had in a long time. He served as director of the CIA. He served as the nation's representative to the United Nations. He served as vice president under Ronald Reagan. And of course, he served as president of the United States. He basically always put country ahead of self. He grew up and lived a life of service to his country. He volunteered for the military at 18. He was shot down in the Pacific. and his colleagues died, and he didn't. And the stories are constantly being talked about as he spent his whole life wondering why he had been spared and living his life in an effort to devise an answer to that question. This is what Douthart is talking about. When you combine these two articles in the Atlantic, you begin to see that the Bush nostalgia constitutes a longing for something America used to have and doesn't really have anymore: a ruling class that was deemed legitimate, that inspired various kinds of trusts, and is not visible in today's society. The term used to be for this, the term WASP, W-A-S-P, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That was the ruling class elite that ruled for so long in this country. These people were raised to serve, to hold high office. They were educated appropriately. I know I've talked on this program numerous times about John Adams and Abigail and the way they raised their children. John Quincy Adams was educated, was raised to be President of the United States. He traveled the world extensively. He was very comfortable in the major courts of Europe. He had a high quality education, Harvard education. He had a law degree. He had been around the world. He interacted with any number of different nationalities and races. He was comfortable. He was what we call today cosmopolitan. He had the kind of breeding and upbringing that to many people made him qualified, legitimate, to be President of the United States. And Douthart makes the point. The fact that these things are true doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to love it, that everybody has to admire the aristocracy. Most people don't. Because the fact of the matter is, it was an elite. It was arrogant. These people were raised to believe that they were better than anybody else. They were raised to believe that the nation needed them more than they needed the nation. They felt that they were born to serve. And they did it. But they were narrow. For the most part, in many cases, they were racist. They were arrogant. But what Douthart is saying is that when you look at the outpouring of nostalgia this weekend with the death of George Herbert Walker Bush, you begin to get a sense that people miss that. They miss the legitimacy of it. They are bothered by the fact that the current president doesn't seem to have any of the qualities that we've always believed a president must have. Foer believes in this Atlantic article that a lot of this nostalgia is bunk. All these calls are driving me crazy. I apologize. Foer believes that much of this nostalgia is bunk because WASPs were often bigots. And their idea of noblesse oblige was oftentimes really about preserving their own place in American society. Noblesse oblige. A French word, a French term for an obligation to serve. Noblesse oblige, the obligations of the nobility. The assumption is that certain people are born into a class where their principal responsibility is to serve the nation, serve their community, serve people. But the fact of the matter is, oftentimes it's to benefit yourself and secure your own position in these areas. Douthart talks about the fact that many of the virtues of these WASPs were superficial, dressing nicely, but not acting nicely, writing thank you notes, while at the same time they hired people to do their dirty work in politics so they didn't have to do it. As Douthart says, the ruling class, the WASP class, was bigoted, exclusive, and often cruel. You can't deny that. But on the other hand, there's something about it that people missed. And that's coming out this weekend in the nostalgia for President Bush. It doesn't exist anymore, this elite. But the fact of the matter is, Douthart said, it didn't just disappear by itself. It's been replaced by what we call today the meritocracy. The argument that American society is not consistent with the idea of an elite, that elites don't belong in this nation. In this nation, power belongs to those most qualified to exercise it. Power and privilege are rewards for ability and talent, we like to believe. Many members of the traditional aristocracy bought into this and actually believed that the meritocracy was probably going to end up leading society better than they could. But one of the things that Douthart points out, which I think is very significant, is that even though this WASP generation was replaced by what we call today the meritocracy, the fact of the matter is it also has become an aristocracy. That this group of people who reached the top ostensibly by merit rather than by birth have pulled the ladder of opportunity up behind them in order to keep out opportunity for more people. In other words, once they made it to the top, they've done everything they can do to make sure that they stay there. So in effect, they've become an aristocracy itself. They've become as bigoted and as exclusive as the aristocracy they replaced. Just think of the current situation that's been going on with Harvard, because the allegation has been made that Harvard is intentionally discriminating against Asian students in order to make sure that Asians don't dominate the Harvard student population. Because if you based admissions exclusively on test scores and school records of performance, Asian students tend to outperform everybody else. So the only way that you can keep the student body at Harvard from becoming 40-45% Asian is to discriminate against Asian students. So the irony of the situation is this new aristocracy is as elitist as the old one. But the downside, or another downside of this new aristocracy, is that it has none of the positives of the old one. The virtues of noblesse oblige, the ability of service to others, stooping over to help others, personal austerity, piety, the idea that you were raised in privilege for service, not just your own success. The fact that at 18, Bush volunteered to be a fighter pilot. And became a member of the military, fighting alongside farmers, mechanics, and all the rest. Douthart says WASP virtues also included cosmopolitanism. This old elite was very comfortable with different kinds of people, different nationalities, different races, different religious groups. They were used to dealing with them. They were used to interacting with them. What we have today in our so-called meritocracy is a lack of cosmopolitanism. These people tend to be exclusionary, bigoted. Basically, what Douthart's concern is, obviously the old aristocracy had to change. It had to find a way to adapt. It had to try to find a way to become more in tune with the values of this country, opportunity for women, for different races, for different geographical portions of the country. It had to open up, but it didn't have to disappear. And it did. This is what Douthart said. I think this is one of the most powerful paragraphs in the entire article. He said, so it is possible to imagine adaptation rather than outright surrender as a different WASP strategy across the 60s and 70s. In such a world, the establishment would have still admitted more blacks, Jews, Catholics, Hispanics, women into its ranks, but it would have done so self-consciously as part of a strategy of introducing different groups of people into the elite. But that wouldn't have driven it out of business. The goal would have been to keep piety and discipline embedded in the culture in places like Harvard and Yale, rather than mixed self-righteousness and raw ambition that replaced them. Meritocracy today is placed on self, emphasizes success, emphasizes ambition, emphasizes wealth. Gone is the emphasis on service. Gone is the idea of noblesse oblige. Gone is the kind of education that prepares one to live a life of service and to be a leader of your community. Unfortunately, that's what we've lost, Douthart believes, when this aristocracy disappeared. And then Douthart closes with an article that appeared in Hedgehog Review in 2016 by Helen Andrews on meritocracy and those who question it. And let me read this paragraph from that article because I think it's very, very telling. The meritocracy, she said, Andrews says, is hardening into an aristocracy. So let it. Every society in history has had an elite. And what is an aristocracy but an elite that's put some care into making itself presentable? I thought that's a beautiful line. What, after all, is an aristocracy but an elite that has put some care into making itself presentable? Allow the social forces that created this aristocracy to continue their work and embrace the label. By all means, this caste, this new aristocracy, if you will, should admit as many worthy newcomers as is compatible with a sense of continuity. New brains, like new money, she says, have been necessary for every ruling class, meritocracy or not. If ethnic balance is important to the meritocrats, build it into the system. If geographic diversity seems important to the system, make sure it exists. In other words, open it up. But the fact of the matter is, include as well the positive virtues and values that were lost with the demise of the WASP generation, the traditional aristocracy in this country. The idea of noblesse oblige, the idea of service, the idea of education and travel and cosmopolitanism that's associated with a diverse nation, a diverse world, an interconnected world. Because the fact of the matter is, this nation is changing. The estimates are that by 2025, more than half of the children born in this country will be non-white. No longer is this country going to be dominated by a particular race or a particular religion or a particular ethnic group. We're going to become more and more diverse, more and more pluralistic. We got to have people on top that know how to handle it. That's Douthart's thesis. I wanted to raise it. I don't want you to believe that I necessarily subscribe to it. I find it offensive. I find meritocracy appealing. I like to believe that the people who make it do so because they earned it, because they have the talent and the skills and the willing to work necessary to produce. I don't think we ought to have a society where people make it just because of who they are or who their parents were or what neighborhood they were raised in or what schools they graduated from or what churches they attended or what clubs they belonged to or what labels are on the inside of their clothing. But the fact of the matter is, Douthart is right in his idea that there's something about that period in our history when people considered leaderships that came out of that group as somehow legitimate. They had been educated for it. They've been trained for it. We can't risk putting people in positions of authority and influence in this country who don't have what we need to make the nation successful. We've got to rely on the people who were raised to do it and educated to do it well. Think about that. Think about whether, in fact, what he suggests about George Herbert Walker Bush is true. Is that why people are looking so fondly on President Bush over this past weekend when he passed away on Friday? Do people really believe that he represents the end of an era, and that from this time on, from his administration on, every president was flawed? Some people had it in for Barack Obama because he was non-white. But people honestly will acknowledge that they miss the class. They miss the ability to say the right things at the appropriate time. They missed the fact that they didn't have to worry about him saying the wrong things at the wrong time. But more and more we're seeing that today. But the fact of the matter is, what we're seeing is not the result of meritocracy at all, because it's a passed down aristocracy that is replacing the old one. President Trump talks about, for example, the fact that his father gave him $1 million to go into business when he was still in his teens. Think about that. Think about the gaffes that President Trump makes, not only in leadership decisions he makes in this country, but in the presentation he makes in these international conclaves around the world. A lot of people are basically looking at last week's G20 and classifying as a success. But the fact of the matter is, was it a success because good things happened there, or was it a success because this is the first time, it seems, that President Trump went overseas and didn't do anything to embarrass us? Although there was one particular video of him walking off the stage not knowing where he was supposed to go and all of that, but that's kind of minor. I think that happens all the time. I wonder. I have to say that when I read this article for the first time this morning, I was offended by it, because it seemed to be a defense of aristocracy, a defense of elitism, a defense of those people who were born into positions of power and influence and therefore deserved the right to stay there and be there. I resented that because it violates everything that I believe. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to recognize that there's something in what Douthart is saying in his article that makes sense to me. I'm wondering if it does to you. We have like 6 minutes left in our time together today. I had one more item that I wanted to cover, but I obviously am not going to get through it all. But I can introduce it anyway and tell you what I got. At the end of last week, based on programs we did over the last couple of weeks, If you remember, we got into the Phaedrus, Plato's Phaedrus, and we get into the issue of the written word. Brett Stevens' column, which he wrote a couple of weeks ago on Facebook, about Facebook, in which he cited Plato's Phaedrus and the myth of the king of Egypt who turned down the gift of words, the gift or the art of writing, because he felt that it would be a disservice to his country. It would pose more problems than it would solve. In the Phaedrus, in the Republic, King Thamus of Egypt talks about the gift of writing. He said, excuse me, he warned that this gift will implant forgetfulness in the people's souls. They will cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written, calling things to remembrance no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks. It's no true wisdom that you offer your disciples, Thamus says, but only its semblance. You will make them seem to know much, while for the most part, they know nothing. And then I also cited the Lincoln quote about character. Character is like a tree, reputation like its shadow. The shadow is what we think of it. The real thing is the tree. And in the Phaedrus, Plato makes the point that by telling people things without teaching them, you make them seem to know much, while for the most part they know nothing. These are men filled not with wisdom, but with the conceit of wisdom. I address this piece to political leaders, educators, parents, caregivers, guardians, all those who teach. Beware of false gods, because that's what the Phaedrus is warning us against. And then I turned to the issue of education. And I went, many of you I know have heard this expression. I heard it many times growing up. Those who can do. Those who can't teach. I never knew where that came from until I looked it up this weekend. It's from George Bernard Shaw's Man and Superman. It was performed on the London stage for the first time in 1903 when it was written. What I suggested is Plato's Phaedrus is giving us the idea that there's more to that than just putting down teachers. Because what we find is that much in our education system is based on the written word. So according to the Phaedrus, the king of Egypt turned down the gift of the written word because it would produce more negatives than it would deliver positives. But the fact of the matter is, what are we dealing with in education today? We're dealing with a nation that totally accepted the gift of the written word. And we're complaining about the quality of education that our young people are getting. And it suddenly dawned on me that the answer to our education problems is to reverse the process that the king of Egypt warned us about. In other words, if the gift of writing was going to make it unnecessary for people to remember anymore or to look within themselves for answers to questions, but merely to look at external markers, then maybe the answer to our problem in education is that we've never yet been able to reverse that process, to bring students, take students from the written word back to what the written word symbolizes, back to the reality. Phaedrus warns us that the written word basically replaces reality. Now that we got the written word, we need to find a way to take students from the written word back to the reality. Because the fact of the matter is, so much of what we always thought was true knowledge really wasn't. And so the question I'm raising, maybe good teaching is illusory as well. Maybe many of the assumptions about education that we've had for so long, or made for so long, are inaccurate as well. We've for so long believed that only the few could be educated, and that our job in our classes and in our courses was to find ways to educate the few. Phaedrus tells us that maybe we've been mistaken. And maybe what we need to do is begin to concentrate on educating everybody, not just the few. I'll get into this next time because we're out of time on this Wednesday. And I do apologize. I've actually gone over by a minute. Let me wish you a very, very wonderful rest of Wednesday and rest of the week. We won't be back together again until Monday. I hope that you have a wonderful weekend. I hope that the weather is good to you. I think everybody's kind of holding their breath and crossing their fingers here. Thank you so very, very much for your continued willingness to support this program, support Bob and Agnes at Head On. I hope you have a great week. Thank you.